Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the macabre legend of the Broussard family, a clan of inbred cannibals in early 20th century Louisiana that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled, and if this story truly captivates you. If it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. At the dawn of the 20th century, Louisiana was a land of stark contrasts, a place where civilization's reach was tenuous, often yielding to the primal authority of nature. While cities like New Orleans hummed with the vibrant, chaotic rhythm of industrial progress and cultural fusion, the vast interior swamplands remained another world, entirely a kingdom forgotten by time, governed by its own ancient, inscrutable laws. Here, amid the colossal, drooping cypress trees, whose branches dripped with Spanish moss like the beards of old men, and over the black, stagnant waters that mirrored a perpetually grey sky, trails were but faint, muddy scars upon the earth, easily erased by the next heavy rain. It was in these isolated, hidden corners, where the archaic traditions of the first French colonists still lingered like a persistent fog, that a horrifying story began to take root, growing silently in the shadows. Beginning in 1905, an unspoken fear started to spread like a silent plague through the sparse rural communities surrounding the burgeoning town of Shreveport. It was a fear born not of loud declarations or official warnings, but of absences, families, simple folk on arduous journeys to find a new life, visit kin, or transport goods, began to vanish. They did not disappear in a manner that offered the grim comfort of explanation of violent struggle, a staged robbery, or a known feud. Their vanishing was far more unsettling, a quiet erasure from the world. Later travelers, their own wagons groaning under the oppressive humidity, would find the evidence a solitary wagon abandoned on the roadside, its cargo strangely undisturbed. The horses, loyal beasts of burden, would be found wandering nearby, still in their harnesses, their eyes wild with a panic that had no name. Inside the wagons, the intimate details of a life interrupted remained untouched, neatly folded clothes, worn farming tools, children's handmade toys, and even small sums of money carefully stored for emergencies. There was no single footprint to follow, no drop of blood to betray violence, not a single sign to indicate where they had gone or what had befallen them. It was as if, in one horrifying, silent moment, the damp Louisiana earth had opened its maw and swallowed them whole, leaving not even a whisper behind. No one could imagine that the truth was far more terrestrial and infinitely more monstrous, that deep in the heart of the swamps, a family had forged a terrible solution to the timeless problem of food scarcity. It was a solution built on generations of secrets, of blood spilled and blood shed, and a tradition so grotesquely distorted it would challenge everything we know about human nature. The answer to this horrifying riddle lay not in the supernatural folklore of the bayou, but was rooted deep within the swamp itself, on a piece of land left behind by the outside world, an island of human experience adrift in a sea of cypress and shadow. The Brousard family had lived for more than 60 years on an isolated property nestled in the middle of the Louisiana swamps. The land, a grim inheritance passed from one generation to the next, was nearly a 2-hour ride by sturdy horse from the nearest town, accessible only by a network of muddy, treacherous trails that became impassable, river-like quagmires during the frequent rains. It was the kind of place where a person could live and die, their entire existence unfolding between birth and burial, without the outside world ever knowing their name. The Broussard property itself was a sprawling, chaotic labyrinth of improvised constructions scattered across several acres of swampy land. The main house, a grim two-story structure made of dark, almost black wood, perpetually damp and covered by a rusty zinc roof, housed the adults and older children. Its windows were like vacant eyes, staring out into the oppressive green of the surrounding swamp. Around it were scattered smaller, crudely built cabins, leaning sheds, an abandoned and rotting corral, and other structures that seemed to have been built without any discernible plan, as if each generation had simply added what they needed. Their architecture a physical manifestation of their insular, evolving existence. But what was most striking to any rare visitor was not the poverty or the disarray, but the profound, organized silence that reigned over the property. It was an unnatural quiet, even with 14 people living and working there. Loud conversations or the noisy activities of children were rarely heard. The daily labor mending tools, tending to a small, struggling garden, working in the sheds was executed in an almost religious silence. Each family member, from the smallest child to the oldest adult, knew exactly their responsibilities without the need for verbal instructions. Communication seemed to occur through a series of subtle glances, gestures, and an instinctual understanding born of complete and total immersion in their shared reality. The foundation of this profound isolation was reinforced by a much darker tradition, a secret kept locked within the family's bloodline for generations. The Broussards had systematically practiced inbreeding. Siblings married siblings, cousins married cousins, and, in some recorded instances, parents had children with their own offspring. This created a kinship network so complex and tangled that traditional notions of family father, mother, sister, brother had become irrelevant and fluid. They believed, or so the matriarch would later claim, that this would keep the family bloodline pure and strong. In reality, it created a closed genetic and social loop, a feedback of pathologies that cut them off not only from society, but from its conventional moral codes. They had become an island, a nation unto themselves, with their own laws, their own language, and their own horrifying reality. And ruling over this silent, isolated kingdom was a dynasty forged in seclusion, a family as complex and disturbing as the swamp that concealed them. At its head, the undisputed queen, was Clémence Brousard, the 75-year-old matriarch of the clan. Small and bent with age, she moved with a slow, deliberate shuffle, yet her eyes still gleamed with a cruel, piercing intelligence that made anyone feel uncomfortable, as if she could see the marrow in their bones. She always wore the same faded black dress, a garment that seemed as old as she was, and a heavy shawl that smelled perpetually of wood smoke and something else, something vaguely metallic and sweet that the few neighbors who had ever gotten close could never completely identify. Her son, Alcide Brousard, 42 years old, was the official patriarch of the family. The public face of their seclusion, tall and unnaturally thin, with sunken eyes that always seemed to be scanning the horizon for threats. He spoke little. When he did, his hoarse voice sounded more like the growl of a cornered animal than human words. His enormous, calloused hands bore a web of scars from decades of handling improvised tools and performing work that no outsider could completely comprehend. Beside Alcide, his half-sister, Cordelia Broussard, 38 years old, exercised almost equal influence, acting as the clan's chief enforcer. Cordelia was responsible for organizing the daily labor of the women and children, and her intimidating presence, a cold, silent watchfulness, made everyone obey without question. She had the same sunken eyes as Alced, but where his held suspicion, hers held a more refined, calculated cruelty, as if she had developed more subtle, psychological methods of control over the younger, more vulnerable family members. But then, around the bleak, wet winter of 1901, something had changed within the Broussard family's hermetically sealed world. According to the later observations of Father Gilbert Horton, the parish priest who made infrequent and unwelcome attempts to minister to the region's outlying families. It was around this time that the clan began to show signs of inexplicable prosperity. Their clothes, though still simple and homespun, seemed to be in better condition, mended with the care they previously lacked. The children, who on past occasions had appeared malnourished and listless, began to show signs of a more abundant, richer diet. There was a new energy in them, a disturbing vitality that seemed out of place in their grim surroundings. From 1902 onwards, local merchants in the nearest town began to notice significant changes in the Brousard family's habits. Their visits to trade became more frequent and highly organized. Family members, often the stoic Eulalie, would appear weekly, the wagon laden with large quantities of salted meat to trade for essential supplies like flour, salt, and tools. The amount of meat they brought to sell had increased dramatically, suggesting a much more abundant source of game than any isolated family, no matter how skilled at hunting, should have been able to obtain with such staggering regularity. The first concrete tear in the fabric of the region's fragile peace occurred in the damp, unsettling chill of March 1902. The Morrison family, James, his wife Sarah, and their 3 small children, whose laughter was said to be as bright as the Louisiana sun, were traveling from the relative bustle of Shreveport to a small, remote agricultural community where James had secured work at a sawmill. Their wagon was a vessel of modest dreams, loaded with a few earthly possessions and provisions for the 2-day journey. They were a portrait of pioneer hope, their faces turned toward a future painted in the humble colors of hard work and simple faith. They departed on a Monday morning, waving cheerful goodbyes to the few who saw them off. 3 days later, a group of lumberjacks, their axes glinting in the dappled sunlight, found the Morrison wagon abandoned in a clearing, approximately 5 kilometers from the unseen, brooding edge of the Brousard property. The scene was a perfect, terrifying echo of the disquieting rumors that had been whispered over campfires and in hushed tavern corners. The horses had been released and were found wandering aimlessly, their harnesses still buckled, their eyes wide with a frantic, unnameable panic. Inside the wagon, the intimate details of a life abruptly halted remained untouched, a silent testament to their sudden departure. Sarah's sewing basket lay open, a needle still threaded in a piece of mending. The children's handmade wooden toys were scattered on a blanket. Even the small amount of money James carried for emergencies was still tucked away in a tin box. Everything was there, except the 5 people who gave these objects meaning. This time, however, it was not a rumor to be dismissed. The Morrisons were known, their names and faces familiar. Their disappearance was a tangible event, a confirmed absence that marked the formal beginning of a storm of fear that would soon engulf the entire area. Just as the Broussards' inexplicable prosperity had become a source of quiet speculation in town, so too did the quality of their product, the local merchant who most frequently traded with the family. A man named Silas Croft began to harbor a deep-seated unease that curdled in his stomach long after the Broussards' wagon had departed. He had grown up in the region, had hunted and trapped in these very swamps since he was a boy, and he knew every type of game the land had to offer. Yet, this meat was peculiar. It was consistently lighter in color than venison, more unnervingly tender than wild boar, and it carried a distinct, slightly sweetish odor that lingered beneath the heavy salt, a smell he couldn't identify, but that made him feel vaguely nauseous every time he handled it. His cautious inquiries were always met with the same laconic, unblinking response from Eulalie or Magnolia: swamp game. The answer was a stone wall, their eyes revealing nothing, offering no purchase for further questions. Their commercial relationship was built on a strained foundation of dread. Each transaction felt like a pact with something ancient and unwell. The behavior of the Broussard children during these town visits had also transformed into something deeply unsettling. No longer shy and withdrawn, they now moved with a chilling, military-like discipline, always remaining in a tight formation and never straying from the watchful eyes of the responsible adults. But it was their interactions with his own wares that disturbed the merchant most profoundly. When they approached the counter where he kept his stock of dried and cured meats for sale, their behavior was always the same. They would lean in as a group, their movements synchronized, and smell the meat intensely, their nostrils flaring like animals identifying prey. Their eyes were not the eyes of children. They were the cold, appraising eyes of old predators. In their silent assessment, Silas Croft felt a disturbing shift in the natural order of things. They seemed to be comparing his offerings to something they knew intimately, and their expressions always held a flicker of disappointment, a silent, unified judgment that his conventional meats were somehow inferior, lacking a certain essential quality they had come to expect. As the humid summer of 1902 bled into the bleak winter of 1903, the disappearances escalated with a terrifying, almost rhythmic predictability. The Thibodeaux family, respectable merchants from New Orleans visiting relatives for a christening, vanished in the same confounding manner. 6 more families followed in the course of that year, their stories all ending with an abandoned wagon, untouched belongings, and a cold, dead-end trail. By 1903, the situation had devolved into a full-blown crisis. 12 families disappeared throughout the year, an average of 1 family per month. The fear in the region was no longer a whisper. It was a palpable entity, a heavy blanket of dread that stifled commerce and poisoned neighborly trust. Many merchants and travelers refused to use the rural roads altogether, preferring to make enormous, time-consuming detours or simply cancel their trips, effectively isolating the very communities that depended on them for survival. Roads that were once arteries of commerce became veins of terror. It was during this period of growing, suffocating terror that Father Gilbert Horton's quiet unease began to crystallize into a monstrous, unshakable suspicion. During his pastoral visits throughout the region journeys, he now made with a heavy heart and a watchful eye. He had observed that the number of people on the Brousard property seemed to fluctuate inexplicably. Sometimes, from the relative safety of a distant ridge, he could see many figures moving between the crude constructions, a hive of silent activity. At other times, the property seemed almost deserted, held in that unnatural, organized silence that he found more disturbing than any noise. But it was his growing awareness of a horrifying pattern that truly began to haunt his waking hours and invade his dreams. He began to keep a meticulous journal, his entries written in a shaky hand by the flickering light of a candle. The scratching of his pen, the only sound in the lonely rectory. He noted the dates each family was reported missing. He then painstakingly cross-referenced these dates with his own observations of the Brousard property and what he learned from the increasingly unnerved town merchant, Silas Croft. The correlation that emerged from the pages of his journal was as precise as it was terrifying. Whenever a family disappeared, the Brousard property would fall completely silent for a period of 2 or 3 days, as if all its residents had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the swamp themselves. Then, on the fourth day, activity would resume with an almost frantic, industrial intensity. Smoke would be seen rising from several chimneys simultaneously, even on the warmest of days. A greasy, dark smoke that carried the same faint, sweetish odor that so disturbed the merchant. And on the fifth or sixth day, like clockwork, a Broussard wagon would appear in town, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of an exceptionally large quantity of their strangely pale, salted meat. This knowledge became a spiritual and psychological torment for Father Horton. He was a man of God, a shepherd, trained to see the good in his flock. But the evidence his own eyes and ears had gathered pointed towards a conclusion so vile, so contrary to divine and natural law, that his mind recoiled from it. The idea was an abomination, a blasphemy he dared not even articulate in his most private prayers. Yet the pattern held, month after month, with the grim certainty of death itself. The disappearances continued. The eerie silence fell upon the Brousard land. The strange smoke rose to the heavens, and the meat arrived in town. The cycle was as regular as the changing of the seasons, a macabre harvest conducted in the shadows of the swamp. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his very soul, that he could no longer stand by as a passive, terrified observer. The souls of the lost cried out for justice, and his own soul demanded action. During the sweltering, humid summer of 1905, he resolved to move beyond observation and begin a discreet, perilous investigation of his own. He began taking long, purposeful walks through the region, ostensibly for prayer and reflection, but always circling, ever closer, to the forbidden periphery of the Brousard property. It was during one of these walks in the oppressive heat of late August that his worst fears took gruesome, physical form. He was following a seldom used trail, a path nearly reclaimed by the swamp's relentless vegetation. That passed about a kilometer from the Broussard's land when a strange smell reached him on the humid, stagnant air. It wasn't the normal, earthy smell of animal decomposition one would expect in a swamp, but something different, sweeter, richer, and at the same time so profoundly nauseating that he had to cover his mouth with his handkerchief. The air itself felt sick, heavy with a sweet, cloying perfume of decay that was profoundly, unnaturally human. He followed the scent, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, pushing through thick underbrush until he arrived at an area where the recent, intense summer rains had washed away part of the soft, loamy soil, exposing what had been buried just beneath the surface. What he found made him physically recoil, and a gasp of horror escaped his lips. He had to brace himself against the rough bark of a cypress tree to keep from falling to his knees. Pieces of fabric, clearly belonging to human clothing, emerged from the soaked black earth. They weren't old rags or discarded clothes. They were torn pieces of dresses, shirts, and trousers that seemed to have been violently ripped from their wearers. Poking gently at the mud with a fallen branch, his hand trembling, he uncovered more shoes of different sizes, including a small child's shoe, impossibly small, with a tattered, mud-stained sock still tucked inside. With a growing sense of dread, he began to dig carefully around the objects with his bare hands. His fingers closed around rusted coat buttons, a tarnished belt buckle, a woman's simple, silver-plated brooch, a child's crudely carved wooden toy soldier. And then his fingers closed around something hard and white. He scraped the mud away to reveal a small collection of human teeth. Their pristine enamel, a stark, horrifying white against the black earth. The sheer quantity and variety of objects buried in this one small area suggested that this location had been used as a dumping ground, a makeshift grave for the personal effects of multiple people over a considerable period. That night, Father Gilbert Horton wrote in his diary, his script nearly illegible from the trembling of his hand, the ink smudged by his own sweat. I found today evidence that confirms my worst fears about the fate of the disappeared families. The quantity of personal objects, the clothes of women and children, combined with the family's transformed behavior and the damnable temporal pattern of disappearances, leads me to a conclusion that my Christian mind refuses to completely accept. But the earth does not lie. The earth has shown me their sin. God forgive them, and God forgive me for what I must now do. The journey from the makeshift grave to Shreveport was the longest of Father Gilbert Horton's life. The evidence in his leather bag felt like a physical weight on his soul, a child's shoe, a rusted buckle, and the unnerving finality of human teeth. He sought out Sheriff Augustus Landry, a weathered man who trusted the priest's instincts over local rumors. The meeting took place on a sweltering September afternoon. Visibly shaken, the priest placed the bag on the sheriff's desk, according to official records. The priest reported several damning details: the abnormally large number of people living on the Brousard property, the unsettling physical similarities among the children, the family's unexplained prosperity since 1902, and the temporal correlation between regional disappearances and the Brousard family's surges in trade. Landry listened with grim focus, examining the contents. A small, crudely made rag doll caught his attention. It was stained with old blood. What chilled the sheriff was his recognition of the faded calico fabric. It was identical to the dress little Amélie Thibodeaux had been wearing when her entire family vanished without a trace in 1902. The connection was instant and horrifying. An immediate official investigation was necessary. The very next day, Landry organized a search group of 8 deputies and 4 tracking dogs. Their objective was a systematic search around the Broussard property for more evidence, or, in the worst-case scenario, the bodies of the 42 people who had vanished over the last 4 years. The seasoned hunting dogs became agitated immediately upon entering the vicinity. In less than 2 hours, the team uncovered a burial ground far larger than the priest had imagined. The soft swamp soil preserved hundreds of personal objects scattered over almost an acre, shoes of all sizes, torn clothing suggesting frantic violence, wedding rings, pocket watches, and leather-bound family Bibles. Digging deeper, they made the discovery that confirmed their worst fears. About half a meter down, their shovels struck human bones. Many bones of different sizes, delicate ribs and skulls, clearly belonging to small children among them, were haphazardly mixed with animal bones in a crude attempt at disguise. Dr. Rodney Manning, the local coroner, was summoned. His initial analysis confirmed bones from at least 22 different people in that first area alone. What most disturbed the doctor was the systematic way the bones had been treated. Many showed precise, clean-cut marks, as if the flesh had been expertly removed by someone with considerable butchering experience. Dr. Manning concluded the bones had been processed with professional and efficient butchering. The consistency of the cuts suggested not only experience, but also specialized tools for processing human meat on an industrial scale. Sheriff Landry recorded in his reports that he felt physically nauseated upon fully understanding the truth. This was not just mass murder. This was an industrial cannibalism operation that had functioned with terrifying efficiency for 4 years, completely undetected. The next morning, Landry organized an operation with 15 armed men to approach the property. They knew they were dealing with at least 14 dangerous individuals. The Broussard property, now viewed with monstrous knowledge, was a complex deliberately organized to conceal and facilitate horrible activities on an industrial scale. The first shed contained an improvised industrial slaughterhouse. Heavy wooden tables were stained dark and sticky with old blood. Knives adapted from agricultural tools, bone saws, and cleavers lay in neat rows. Large, sharp metal hooks dangled from the ceiling. The smell was unbearable, a gagging mixture of dried blood, decomposition, and the same sweet, nauseating odor the priest had first detected. The shed was organized like a highly efficient production line, with specific areas for initial slaughter, skinning, cutting, and preservation. A second shed contained preservation equipment on an impressive scale. Over 50 large wooden barrels were filled with coarse salt. Extensive wooden shelves for drying meat lined the walls, and there was a sophisticated area for smoking. The sheer amount of equipment suggested the family processed far more meat than they could consume, confirming suspicions that they had been selling a significant portion of their horrific production as legitimate game meat. In the back of the property, they found a series of 6 large pits dug in the soft swamp soil, containing a grotesque, layered mixture of human and animal bones. Dr. Manning estimated that they held the remains of the other 20 missing people. The grim organization suggested the family operated their cannibalism system with the cold, detached efficiency of a well-run factory, processing an average of more than 10 people per year for 4 years. As officers surrounded the main house, they heard agitated voices speaking rapidly in the archaic French dialect that characterized the family. There was frantic movement between the sheds, suggesting they were trying to hide evidence or prepare an escape. Landry positioned his men before announcing his presence. When the sheriff ordered everyone out, the response was total chaos. Figures ran in all directions, shouting in French, and it became terrifyingly clear that the family had prepared escape routes deep into the swamps. The deputies managed to intercept some, but others disappeared into the dense vegetation. The officers managed to capture only 7 members of the family Clemeños: the elderly matriarch, her daughter, Cordelia, and 5 of the younger children. 7 family members, including the patriarch Alcide and the other primary adults, had managed to escape into the impenetrable swamp beyond the slaughterhouse and bone pits. The property investigation revealed more disturbing evidence. Investigators found victims' personal objects, clothing, jewelry, and toys organized not as trash, but as macabre trophies. Even more shocking was the discovery of detailed records kept by Clemeños herself, written in archaic French. A series of notebooks documented each family attacked, with chillingly practical descriptions of the number of victims, the quality of the meat obtained, preparation methods, and evaluations of which family members provided the best meat. It was a macabre library of cannibalistic recipes. In the main house, investigators found evidence that the children had been systematically trained to participate. There were children's drawings depicting human hunting and meat processing, toys carved from human bones, and a handwritten manual teaching the children to identify different types and cuts of human meat. Dr. Manning concluded that the Broussard family had operated the most organized and efficient cannibalism system ever documented. The trial of the captured Brousard family members became one of the most disturbing cases in Louisiana's judicial history. Clémence Broussard, as the matriarch and confessed leader, became the main focus. At 75, she sat in the dock with an expression of cold, intellectual superiority. When the judge read the long list of charges, 42 counts of murder, systematic cannibalism, she listened with mild boredom. Her daughter, Cordelia, tried as the principal accomplice, demonstrated the same chilling coldness with an additional layer of technical arrogance. She not only confirmed all the crimes, but even corrected the prosecutor when he incorrectly described technical aspects of human meat processing, as if she were a master butcher correcting an apprentice. Clémence maintained her defiant posture. She confirmed all details of the murders, but always with the attitude of someone explaining a successful, innovative business model. She justified her actions as necessary and intelligent for survival. When the judge asked if she felt any remorse for the 42 people killed, including 16 children, she paused, looked directly at him, and questioned why she should feel remorse for feeding her family and generating an honest income. She compared her actions to farmers slaughtering cattle, following the same cold logic of survival and business. The 5 captured Broussard children presented a complex legal dilemma. They had actively participated, but were clearly victims of profound psychological damage resulting from the inbreeding and systematic conditioning. Dr. Manning concluded they had been molded since birth to see cannibalism as normal, necessary, and even desirable. The court decided the children would not be tried as adults. Instead, they were sent to different distant religious orphanages where authorities hoped they could be corrected through intensive moral and religious education. Clémence Brousard was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was executed in December 1905. Witnesses reported she maintained her posture of cold, unwavering superiority until the very end. Cordelia received a life sentence. Cordelia's death in prison, 2 years after the trial, marked not an end, but the beginning of a long, haunting epilogue. The true collapse of the Brousard dynasty was playing out not in the sterile confines of the law, but in the dark, untamed wilderness of the Louisiana swamps. The hunt for the 7 escaped family members Alched, Yulie, Boudreaux, Bogard, Magnolia, Thibodeaux, and Celeste became a grim and frustrating affair for months. Sheriff Landry's deputies pushed into the bayous, a world the Broussards knew as intimately as the lines on their own scarred hands. The swamp, which had been their fortress and their larder, now became their tomb. It offered countless hiding places, but it was an unforgiving accomplice. Occasionally, hunters deep in the remote territories would report seeing gaunt figures moving like ghosts through the cypress trees, always at a distance, always vanishing before they could be clearly identified. These sightings painted a picture of a clan devolving, stripped of their organized system and thrown back into a more primal state of survival. In March of 1906, 6 months after the escape, a group of lumberjacks stumbled upon the remains of an improvised campfire on a small muddy island in the middle of the swamp. Around the coal ashes, they found bones. Dr. Manning was once again called upon to examine the remains, and his findings suggested a horrifying turn. The bones were human, and the analysis indicated that at least 3 people were cannibalized at that location. There was no way to determine if the victims were strangers captured by the fugitives or, more chillingly, members of the family itself. Dr. Manning speculated in his official reports that isolation and the lack of their usual, easy prey could have led the fugitives to turn on each other. Cannibalism, once normalized and systematized for profit and sustenance, could easily expand to include any available source of meat, including their own kin, when other options were exhausted. The family that had feasted together was now likely feasting on itself. During the oppressive summer of 1906, fishermen reported sightings of skeletal figures moving through the swamps, always at a distance, always disappearing when someone tried to approach. The descriptions varied, but all mentioned visibly malnourished people wearing rags and moving in ways that suggested extreme desperation and, perhaps, internal violence. The last confirmed piece of evidence of the fugitive Broussard's existence came in August of that year, when a fisherman found a pile of torn and bloodied clothing on a remote riverbank. The clothes were identified as belonging to Yulie and Magnolia. There were signs of a violent struggle in the area, with trampled earth and broken branches, suggesting a final, desperate confrontation. No bodies were ever found. Theories about the fugitives' ultimate fate varied among the investigators. Some believed they had simply died of starvation or disease in the unforgiving swamps. Others speculated that they had killed and eaten each other in a grim dispute over increasingly scarce resources. The most accepted theory, championed by Sheriff Landry in his final reports on the case, was that the family hierarchy had completely collapsed without the iron will of Clemenos to maintain order, resulting in fatal internal violence. The Brousard property itself, the epicenter of their monstrous operation, was burned to the ground by the authorities in September 1906, according to official reports. The fire lasted for 5 days, fueled not only by the dark, weathered wood of the constructions, but also by the years of animal and human fat that had impregnated the very soil, creating a pyre that burned with an unnatural intensity. The smell of the burning, according to local accounts, was unbearable and could be detected for miles. A final foul exhalation from a place of profound evil. Even after the complete destruction of the property, the area remained a cursed and avoided place. Hunters and fishermen who strayed too close reported strange sensations, a feeling of being watched from the shadows, inexplicable cold spots, and a general atmosphere of deep unease that made them want to leave as quickly as possible. During the great floods of 1907 and 1908, regional residents reported that the swamp continued to give up its dead. The churning floodwaters carried fragments of bone and personal objects that had been buried over the 4 years of the family's operation, depositing them on riverbanks and in fields miles away. Each flood brought new, grim evidence of the family's crimes, as if the earth itself refused to keep their secrets buried. The Broussard children, those who survived to be placed in orphanages, had varied and mostly tragic fates. They were the living legacy of the family's darkness, their minds and souls irrevocably shaped by the horrors they had considered normal. Octave, the oldest, died in 1912 at the age of 19 from an infection that doctors suspected was self-inflicted through wounds he repeatedly made on himself. Until the end. Orphanage reports show that he continued to ask about his other family members and expressed profound confusion about why he couldn't simply return home and resume the family's work. Sidonie lived until 1918, but she never managed to form normal human relationships or completely understand why her old practices were considered wrong. She was transferred several times between different institutions, always due to incidents involving attempts to convince other children to try raw meat or aggressive, predatory behaviors during meals. She died at the age of 23 during the Spanish flu epidemic, a victim of a world she could never truly join. The twins, Alcée and Anatole, were separated in 1908 after a series of violent incidents in the orphanages where they were housed. Their shared, distorted reality made them a danger to others. Alcide died in 1910 at the age of 15 after trying to attack a supervisor with a kitchen knife during a meal. Anatole was transferred to an institution for the mentally ill, where he died in 1915 at the age of 20, still expressing the desire to return to his family in the swamps. Only Amélie, the youngest, achieved some degree of social reintegration. After years of intensive religious education, she developed basic social behaviors and was adopted by a family in another state in 1912 at the age of 13, with a completely new identity. According to later records, she lived a relatively normal life. She married and had children, but she never once spoke about her childhood with anyone, taking the unimaginable secrets of her first family to the grave when she died in 1954 at the age of 55. The Brousard case had lasting repercussions in the region and beyond. The rural roads around Shreveport remained little used for years, with many merchants preferring longer but what they considered safer routes. Trust in rural hospitality, a tradition once deeply rooted in Southern culture, was severely shaken for decades. The story became a cautionary tale. A dark legend whispered to children to keep them from wandering too far from home. Father Gilbert Horton, traumatized by his discovery and the role he played in the investigation, requested a transfer to a parish in another state in 1907. In his last notes about the case, he wrote, "I have seen what human beings can become when they completely lose their connection with God and with humanity. An entire family transformed into a death machine, not by demonic possession, but by deliberate choice and systematic planning. May the Lord forgive me. But there is knowledge that no man should carry." Dr. Manning continued to study the medical and psychological aspects of the case for years, eventually publishing several academic articles on the effects of prolonged inbreeding on cognitive and moral development, and on how extreme social isolation can lead family groups to develop moral systems completely disconnected from normal society. Sheriff Landry, despite his long experience with violent crimes, admitted in later interviews that the Broussard case had fundamentally changed his view of human nature and the limits of organized depravity. He implemented regular patrols in the most isolated rural areas of the parish and established new protocols for investigating families living in extreme isolation. The story of the Brousard family is perhaps the most disturbing case of familial cannibalism in recorded history. It wasn't a temporary psychotic outbreak or a series of isolated crimes of passion, but a systematic industrial operation that had functioned with terrifying efficiency for 4 years, processing more than 10 victims per year. What makes this case particularly haunting is the complete absence of supernatural elements. There were no curses, no demonic possessions, no occult forces at work. There were just human beings who, through a perfect storm of extreme isolation, prolonged inbreeding, and a distorted entrepreneurial mentality, had transformed into something that challenged our basic understanding of what it means to be human. The geographical isolation of the Louisiana swamps had allowed these aberrant practices to develop without any external interference. The desperate need to feed 14 people had provided the initial justification for practices that, once initiated, became self-perpetuating and increasingly elaborate. What had begun as a grim solution to survival had transformed into an efficient commercial operation in just 4 years. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire story is the internal logic that the family had developed to justify their actions. For them, there was no moral difference between killing an animal to eat and killing a person for the same purpose. They had simply found a more efficient and profitable way to exploit the available resources. The Brousard case raised profound and uncomfortable questions about the nature of human morality. If 14 people, including small children, are raised from birth to see cannibalism as normal, necessary, and even profitable. Can they be considered fully morally responsible for participating in it? The speed with which they transformed an occasional dark tradition into an industrial operation demonstrates how quickly human beings can adapt to and perfect even the most horrible practices when they are seen as advantageous. The fact that 14 people could participate in such a horrific operation for 4 years also reminds us of how powerful social conditioning can be. The Broussard children didn't choose to become cannibals. They were molded for it from birth, in an environment where such behavior was not only normal, but a source of family pride and sustenance. In the silent swamps of Louisiana, where the cypress trees still whisper ancient secrets to the wind, the story of the Broussard family remains as a somber reminder that the truest monsters don't come from fairy tales or horror movies. They come from within ourselves, when we lose our connection to our shared humanity and allow isolation, necessity, and a cold, ruthless efficiency to transform us into something unrecognizable. The most frightening truth about the Brousard family isn't that they were unique, but that under the right, terrible circumstances, the potential for such systems exists within the dark corners of the human condition. The difference between civilization and organized barbarism may be much smaller and much more fragile than we would like to admit.